So thanks for letting me come here today. I failed to actually retype and reprint my speech, so wish me luck. But I did want to make sure that I had an opportunity to kind of address what you wanted to talk about today, and I wanted to thank I guess the entire university, Brandon, Ashley in particular, for your assistance in getting me here and taking such good care of me. This is a beautiful campus. I've never been down here before. I can see why you guys go to school here. So my hope here really is that you leave with a better understanding and appreciation of a particular area of a type of criminal violence that's going on right now, active shooter, something that a lot of people don't seem to grasp completely, and I wanted to kind of give you some facts about that. Even though they are less frequent than people think they are, the discussions on them are really kind of frightening, and for the sake of brevity, I'm going to limit my comments to a particular couple of areas because I want to give you time to ask questions, and also I'm happy to answer any questions no matter, kind of in what category they fall in. So to try to understand the active shooter phenomenon, I'm going to start by asking you to visualize a puzzle board. I recognized that after the 2012 Sandy Hook massacre up in Connecticut, there was a lot of frustration about what do we do, what do we do? It seems like this is the same problem that we've had. We had that problem at Columbine High School and all these subsequent places. And we really had made so much progress since Columbine, but it didn't really seem like we had. And so I think that once I started to look at it as a puzzle board, and if I indulge you to look at it in that same way, because in particular, because you are all studying in different, and many of you who are students studying in different arenas, you may find that your particular area can help to fill in one of these puzzle pieces, whether it's forensics, whether it's psychology work, whether it's threat assessment, behavioral, or straight up work and security, law enforcement, federal, state, all of those apply. So the first question I get asked almost every media interview that I do after every active shooter event, I get a lot of calls from the media and they want to know, is it really true that the number of incidents is on the rise? And the logical question, right, that everybody asks all the time, for 7 years I wanted to say no, and for 7 years my answer has always been yes. So you'll have a better understanding, I think, of what I appreciate now about what people are discussing, and you can come with more words to the table. The reality is the increases are coming in a certain type of way. If you don't look closely at the numbers, particularly for you who might work statistics, if you don't look closely at the numbers of what you're counting, you're not going to see the same numbers. So I want you to look at these numbers apples to apples. It's very easy to look in the wrong direction if you're looking at all kinds of gun violence. This is not all kinds of gun violence. This is a particular subset of very persistent, uncommon types of incidents. So we are focused on shooters that go into the malls, the movie theaters, the synagogue with seemingly no warning, at Columbine, Navy Yard, Umpqua Community College, Northern Illinois University, Sandy Hook, Virginia Tech, the shooter who lived just a few blocks away from my house and killed a bunch of people. The list goes on. So an active shooter is certainly not every mass killing, so don't mix the terms up. An active shooter is not every mass murder. It's not a barricade situation, it's not a barrage of shooting incidents, it's not a serial killer or drive-by killing. An active shooter is actually defined by the federal government, DHS, FBI, DOJ, HHS, every three-letter organization up in Washington that we all get to the point where we know the names of, and it is an individual actively engaged in attempting to kill people in a confined area. So they're looking for, it's the activity that makes it an active shooter, which seems logical, but nobody seems to understand that when they're doing the numbers. So a small subset of violent crimes that has researchers and law enforcement quite vexed is this number of active shooter incidents. So when I retired from the Bureau in 2017, and now I'm out consulting, I work almost exclusively in this area, and there seems to be no shortage of it. I'm working on major grants and research efforts because the problem is persisting. Now, the FBI took a very active role in this after the Sandy Hook shooting, and therefore they worked to try to provide research with the best baseline data they could. And when you match the FBI's amazing behavioral experts, second to none, with their analytical and agent personnel, and then the local law enforcement that were able to provide us with the actual police reports from the event, the FBI was able to collect data on 225-ish incidents over a 14-year period where we saw the actual police reports, not the data that you have to cull from open source, which makes it very difficult for you to get accurate information. We could spend all night, if we had a couple bottles of wine, talking exactly about why and how and what you think you know about an incident, but what we really know about it, right? So only the FBI really can get access. The FBI or other federal or local state law enforcement can get access to these reports. So their data became very important. So I would ask you, knowing that these shootings are increasing, which they are, and we can talk about that just a little bit, why do people feel like so concerned about these shootings? Because in Gallup polls, Pew Research Center surveys, Americans believe that the current year is more dangerous than the last year. And everybody seems to believe that, but is it really the reality? According to both FBI data and DOJ surveys conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, violent crime has declined 49% between 1993 and 2017. 49%. That is not a small number, and that is over a long period of time, right? Last year alone, just about a month ago, the FBI reported a 4% decline in crime last year. So this kind of begs the question, why all the hysteria over these active shooter incidents? I believe it's because feeling safe and being safe are two different things. Feeling safe and being safe are absolutely two different things. And despite the fact that violent crime has declined dramatically, active shooter incidents, this unique type of incident, is not on the decline, and that makes people scared. That makes people scared. And we've had so little research and data on these except for within the last few years. So because the FBI is in this unique position to access the full police reports, we've been able to collect the data over the time, and we've been able to determine whether or not the data nationwide in the United States is accurate, and others, particularly in academia, are able to look at that data and then take subsets of it and pieces of it and know that their base data is solid. If you look at these 7 incidents or these 12 incidents. So some of you have been in class or done lots of FBI reading of FBI research. I'm sure all of you have. The FBI research showed a study of active shooter incidents from 2000 to 2013. FBI found 160 incidents during that 14-year time span. 160 incidents during 14 years. In the first 7 years of the study, there were just over 6 incidents a year in the first 7 years of the study. In the second 7 years of the study, there were just over 16 incidents a year, which gave me reason to pause and be a little bit surprised. And I was kind of concerned about that. We identified these, and I authored this study and worked with people from Texas State University to look for the information and the best methodology to come up with this information from the police reports and pull down what we could from it, the base data of who was the subject, where were the shootings occurring, when did they occur, what was the age of the shooter, just some basic bio data. So when we got this information, that was pretty frightening to find out that there was that much of an increase. And the FBI has continued to use that same methodology in the years since 2013, and the numbers continue to rise. So, and right now, 6 years after the research was completed, this country now averages 2 shootings a month, about 1 shooting every 15 days, that fits the methodology of active shooters. So there's not just like more media coverage, or there's not just more this or that. 15 every 15 days. In 2018, there were 27 incidents. And after 30 the year before, we're hoping for a little bit better numbers this year, but we don't have the finals. Some other important data that we found out that had to do with these types of incidents and what we were concerned about from a law enforcement standpoint. think about the operational activities and the concerns for law enforcement with this kind of information. Nearly half of the incidents occur in places of business. You think of them as occurring in schools, but half of them occur in places of business, and only about a quarter occur in schools. So places of business are the biggest risk. And I'll tell you that fits with the patterns, not that we can get into all the details of the who does it, which I have a lot of data in my head about, but the common age is people in their 30s and their 40s. Well, that makes sense, because it's businesses. You think of some 20-year-old, but it's people in their 30s or 40s. We also learned that middle school students and high school students shoot up their own school. So how important is it to take care of them from a threat assessment standpoint as opposed to putting up metal barricades and metal detectors and bulletproof glass? They're coming into school with the guns, right? And I'll tell you, because we know about timing, that a lot of these occur in the school shootings. The shootings occur usually at the beginning of the day. High schools, high schools don't come to school on Monday would be my advice. A lot of them are on Mondays. A lot of them are the first weeks of school or the first weeks after the fall break. Colleges, I basically would suggest you guys skip Fridays. That's when most of the shootings occur on schools' campuses, but I digress. And another thing that we learned for law enforcement, of the 45 incidents out of the 160, of the 45 incidents where law enforcement had to engage the shooter to end the threat, almost half of those incidents, a law enforcement officer was shot or killed, which makes this one of the most volatile types of situations law enforcement handles, which also means, when we think about baseline, which also means we need to make sure law enforcement is very well trained, because if they do have to engage, they're going to probably get hit. Worse than a domestic case, worse than a domestic case. So among the most unexpected but kind of hopeful findings for me in the data was that in 21 of 160 incidents, so about 13%, an unarmed civilian selflessly made the deeply personal choice to intercede and successfully stop the shooter. So 13% of the time, civilians themselves stopped the shooting and saved lives. And when you think about that, right, civilians need to be prepared. Civilians need to be trained, and that's one of the reasons why. Something from the study that drives policy decisions today. In the 64 incidents where the duration of the incident itself could be determined down to the minute, nearly 70% ended in 5 minutes or less, and more than half of those in 2 minutes or less. So civilians are the first responders. So anything you do in the law enforcement and the criminal justice community has to include civilians, because civilians are the first responders in these instances. And you can't just lock down and hope for the best. So the advantage to run, hide, fight, something else we pushed out nationally while I was up there working with the White House team, is that the lockdown part, anything that delays is fine. But if you can run, get away. I don't know what they teach here, I shouldn't say that, but I'm just telling you, that's my advice. You can't be shot if you're not there. Behavioral experts agree. So what do we know about the shooters a little bit, right? Behavioral experts agree that people who commit targeted violence move on a predicted path towards the idea of violence, and that idea of violence all the way to the violent act. The first steps in this pathway begin with some sort of grievance. It's real or perceived grievance. And the individual has been somehow wronged. Some people call them grievance collectors. They look for other people who agree with them about how they have been wronged. Maybe it's because I can't get over the breakup. I'm sad I didn't get my promotion. I think that guy got a job I should have gotten, or his car is nicer than mine, whatever. These grievances can be directed at an individual. They can be directed in an organization. And these grievance collectors begin to research potential targets and other shooters and the ways that they can carry them out. That's very common that we see copycat concept and the idea of ideologues for somebody else. These guys did this at Columbine and I'm going to do it that way. It's a very real problem. Columbine has 5 security officers on the high school campus every day and 2 sheriff's officers on the campus every day. Their security department at Columbine High School has a $5 million budget. So it's a tremendous problem. Kids pilgrimage there to commit suicide on the grounds of the campus, right? So often a crisis in their lives can act as a trigger. We see sometimes the shooting that I was just talking to the media about last week in Los Angeles. It was the shooter's 16th birthday. Something can trigger somebody, so there's a grievance, and then something triggers it. So that's where, you know, you think about hoping that somebody doesn't act. You don't know when they're going to act, but a lot of times something can trigger it. But they bubble up, right? So we as civilians can do between the time that a person idealizes this violent act and they commit a violent act is the planning and the preparation stage. In planning and preparation are visual stages. When somebody says, is there a profile? So, you know, is there a profile of who we're looking for? What we're looking for are things that happen in the planning and the preparation stage. So what we're really looking for are behaviors. We're looking for behaviors of concern. So we're not looking for a white 20-year-old playing video games in his basement, isolated from the world. Yes, nearly all the shooters in the United States are male. However, that is the only demographic figure that all researchers agree on, and that's it, is that a majority of them are male, I mean high 90%, and that's okay, except for that you have to remember that if you only count half of the population in the country, you're not looking for people who might be in distress, right? So you have to look at all the population. The age range, 12 to 88 in our study, 12 years old to 88. 6 of the shooters were middle school students. 5 of them shooting at their own school. So 12-year-old kid, you know, it seems like it'd be unusual, it wasn't. In the same way, it's a mistaken belief that all the shooters are white. US Census data puts white at 60.7% in the United States. The shooters are about 63% Caucasian. We hear the term loner all the time. It's a loner. That's a kind of a misnomer. In the terrorism world, because I worked 15 years in the national security world, loner means a completely different thing. And so when we use that term in the FBI, we mean something different than what you possibly think about. When we think of a terrorist, we categorize them into 3 categories. We say this person is either directed to commit a terrorist act, a terrorist group directs them. He's inspired, meaning he reads about terrorist ideologies that he's very supportive of, and I say he, I mean he or she or whoever. That person's either directed by a terrorist group, he's inspired by a terrorist group, or he's a lone offender. That's what we mean by a lone offender. He's acting on his own, he or she is acting on their own, not because they're a lonely person. So I hear that misused all the time. So really, when you think about that, about half the shooters are employed. Most live with people. They interact on a regular basis with others, whether it's family or friends or coworkers. So they could be the people that you attend church with or you see in the grocery store or sitting around you today, although I hope not, right? So to find these individuals, we have to look for behaviors of concern. So those behaviors are what we call atypical behaviors. So if you carry a gun, I carry a gun. I don't have it with me today because I flew down here, but I carry a gun. So if I carried a gun and I started carrying a different gun and I started going to the range a bunch when I normally would never go to the range, that's atypical for me. If you never carry a gun and suddenly, you know, I see you and you're getting angrier and angrier and then suddenly you buy a gun, that's atypical for you. So it's not about the gun or it's not about the whatever, it's about the behavior of their action, and it's atypical. So researchers consistently show that 80 to 90% of the time, people around the shooter have noticed these atypical behaviors. And in FBI research released last year, about half of the time, everybody interviewed acknowledged they never reported the behavior. Half of the people. That's like, holy cow, come on guys, you're talking about saving your own lives. And considering that 13% of these people in our study killed family members, could be saving your own family. So these pre-attack behaviors in the FBI research that was just released this past year said an individual displayed 4 to 5 observable behaviors before the shooting. 4 to 5 observable behaviors, in which we know 85% of those were reported only back to the shooter, and more than half of them were never reported to law enforcement. So these concerning behaviors can come in many forms. Some are more obvious, like acquiring weapons and ammunition and spending more time at the range, ordering bulletproof vests and gathering IED materials or more dangerous weapons. But other atypical behaviors might be something that you might not think of offhand, right? They are an individual who does withdraw from their social group, who may stop grooming themselves, stop taking their medication. That's very common too, with a sense of, I want to have a clear head and I don't want to take that medication that I normally take because I want to be ready for this act. Nobody is born and as a second grader says, I want to go out and commit mass murder. They develop that personality, and sometimes in this type of a situation, they're actually developing kind of an alternate personality. And because it's an alternate personality, not a personality disorder, but what I'm saying is they're convincing themselves to do it, behavior is going to be different. They're going to change their clothing. They might shave their beard off. They might cut their hair short. They might talk about other shootings. But they're going to change some of their behavior about what you see and also what you hear. And of course, the obvious things like postings. Everybody's posting. If you see something posted, it could be imminent and it needs to be reported immediately. Most often you would think that that wouldn't really happen, but in 64% of the incidents that the FBI research just released, 64% of them, the individual actually was targeting somebody, which is the first time we've really ever seen data specifically about targeting. And that's kind of heartwarming to us because it helps us to think about, not to the person targeted, I apologize for that, but what I'm saying is it gives us an idea of where to look, right? Sometimes you're looking for a needle in a needle stack, and it's really hard to find what you're looking for. This helps us in the right direction when time is so the essence. So it's essential to look to the behaviors and then to report them promptly to police or counselors, bosses, teachers, and administrators. And what we, of course, want is we want those reports to be made immediately, even though the research shows that in many times, in 3 out of 4 of people who actually committed these 160 incidents that we researched, 3 out of 4 times the individual spent more than a week or more preparing and planning. So they spend time doing it. These people don't ever snap. That you hear when somebody says that, I'm like, no, that's wrong. They don't snap. They plan and prepare. That gives us that opportunity to see. So when you think back to the idea of all these killings are so random and they just seem to appear out of nowhere, they really don't. That's kind of part of my message is they really don't. You know, researchers have found that when concerning behaviors were observed, you know, more than half of the time they weren't reported at all. That doesn't help us, right? So, so there are a couple of other things that, and I know I'm not keeping track of the time.
You got half an hour.
Okay, good. All right, so because I want to give you guys time for questions, specific questions. But I wanted to talk about a couple of other areas that don't get a lot of conversation, but are related to this. One of them is guns. Now, I know guns is a big issue in the United States. I will tell you, even though I found out today I'm being taped, I don't answer media questions. I answer media questions all the time. I don't answer media questions about guns, just because I'm not in the middle of any politics. But the thing is that the political and the social debate about guns is not really new, it's not unique, and it's not going to go away. But here are a few facts that you can take with you as you discuss the idea of guns. Most shootings, if you don't know this, you should know, most shootings involve guns that were legally purchased. FBI research shows that released last year shows that 40% of the guns used in our incidents that we studied were purchased legally by the incident, prior to the incident. 30% of them were already owned, right? So these are generally guns that are used they're legal. Take that away and for whatever you want to do with it. The majority of the active shooters use handguns. Two handguns to every one long gun. right? But that doesn't discount the fact that most casualties are caused by rifles, right? They're caused by these higher powered weapons. So when you have a higher powered weapon that's brought to the scene, you have a bigger chance of higher casualties. As law enforcement, you know, I know that that's its own frightening risk. I will tell you that when somebody says it's just a handgun, if you don't shoot if you never shot a handgun, you have no concept of how fast I can dump out a bunch of bullets. If you've shot guns, you know what I'm talking about, because especially if you've paid for your ammunition. You're like, oh crap, there's a whole box, right? You know, a box of ammunition, 50 rounds costs like $1 zillion, and then you're on the range practicing for 20 minutes, and you're like, where did those go, right? You can think about if it takes 2 minutes or 1 minute for law enforcement to get there. If I just have handguns and extra magazines, how many people can I kill? An awful lot. An awful lot. So you can't really discount the fact that handguns, oh, it's just a handgun, right? It's just that there are different dynamics. So the gun issues are complex, right? They're complex. The other thing is that mass shootings, in terms of gun violence in the United States, mass shootings account for 0.2% of gun violence in the United States. 0.2% is mass shootings, according to the National Council for Behavioral Health, pulling it from someplace else. They just released that report like the week of the Dayton shooting, thankfully. So, so gun violence itself is not about these types of shootings. It's a part of them, right? It's a part of them, but it's not about these types of shootings. So I do get questions all the time about suicide, and I don't want to speak for, I'm not a suicide expert, and I don't even begin to play one on TV. But there clearly is a link between suicide and this type of gun violence. We found, and subsequent studies have found consistently, that 40% of these incidents, the shooter commits suicide. It's a very common occurrence, and I think it's because the suicidality of it, the concept of I want to commit suicide, comes along with it, and sometimes the frustration and the external, I want to also hurt others around me, or I want to take somebody with me who, for whatever reason, goes with it. So the behavioral concerns that you identify for a person of concern for suicide can be many of the same behaviors we see where the person may also be a threat for an active shooter incident. So when you think about one, think about the other. And it's easy for you to say, to understand the urgency of it if you think in terms of, oh, I think he's going to commit suicide, so I'm going to call right now a 911, or I'm going to go to his house, or I'm going to call a hotline or something. Okay, you should think the same thing, because 40% of these shooters are suicidal. They commit suicide. Politically motivated questioners often ask me about guns and whether they're the problem, and I always tell them in interviews that guns are a tool. But they are a significant tool in the United States. To deny that is really disingenuous based on facts. Researchers show that other countries do not have similar casualty rates from other types of weapons like knives and vehicles. So I do hear that a lot. They say, well, they just use other things. Yeah, they don't. It's not the same. And in other countries, we see coordinated attacks often for political motivations. There's no question about it. It's a different world in the rest of the country, right? In terms of guns, we have a lot of guns here, and they're not going away. And that's part of what I say. Gun availability is pretty loose, and they're not going away. So what we really have to do is do a better job of prevention. That's what we have to do. Better job of prevention. We all remember where we were. We all remember when there were more efforts in the United States. Well, you guys might not, but I do remember when there were more efforts in the United States for gun safety, where guns, they were passing laws saying, oh, everybody has to have a lock on their gun, or they have to lock it up and things like that. And, you know, I mean, my advice is that, you know, imagine how people feel when their kid picks up a handgun or a shotgun at their house and takes it to their school, shoots a bunch of people, and then kills themselves, which is what happened in Los Angeles. Right? That person, that gun was, that high school kid's gun was locked up, and he managed to get into the locked cabinet and get to it. So the people who are left behind are devastated. So if you live in a house or you live near places, you send your kids over to some place, your friends, you know, have guns, they got to be locked up. They just have to be, because in the United States we have guns. So that's what I kind of say about guns. There's also this myth running around that gun-free zones have higher incidence of these types of shootings. There's no statistics to support that. There's also the states that have stricter gun laws have more shootings. Statistics are actually exactly the opposite. So don't get drawn into something based on politics. Look up the data on it if you're not sure. As you know, there's plenty of controversy going about whether or not to arm teachers. And I would tell you, I personally don't think teachers should be armed. That's just my opinion. I have a 25-year-old who is a teacher, but that's my opinion. It's not data-driven. We don't have the data on school arming teachers in schools. We will eventually, of course, but my biggest fear is that a responding active shooter trained law enforcement officer is going to run into a school and shoot an armed teacher because the teacher doesn't know and the law enforcement officer cannot quickly identify that teacher as a non-threat. So a comment on this theory about good guy with a gun. Statistically, there have been a handful of incidents where someone who has a weapon has prevented a shooting from continuing. And that's great. But in over 20 years, this has literally happened only a couple of times. And we have the same number of incidents where a good guy with a gun has been killed. So take that into consideration. And when does that and why does that probably happen? My guess would be because that good guy with a gun, we know in at least 2 instances, the good guy with the gun did not have the current intelligence information to know where other shooters were or what the situational awareness was. And also, if you have never shot a weapon under the adrenaline that is required when you are running towards somebody who could shoot you and kill you and you know you've got kids back at home, you are not going to shoot well. I can guarantee you that. But you can't convince people of that, right? So we have found a couple of situations where civilians have discharged firearms and have not hit the shooter, but have it has turned the shooter away. And that's fantastic. Anything that happens like that is fantastic. But the inability of a civilian to shoot accurately under stress cannot be understated. Right now, statistically, unarmed civilians are more likely to intercept a shooter and stop a shooting, which is kind of something, food for thought. So many states have started to place, when you think about puzzle pieces, many states have started to place restrictions on gun sales or limit magazines. There are red flag laws that potentially could take a weapon away from a person of concern for a short time period. Some states are moving the age of sales from 18 to 21, right? Of course, you know, Walmart has made decisions about whether they're going to sell ammunition or weapons in the future. Dick's Sporting Goods recently reported it destroyed $5 million worth of rifles, a reflection, I think, of their recognized volatility and the risk, liability risk that they faced. The market is going to drive these decisions, but I'll tell you that there's no corporation that has suffered more than Walmart in terms of shootings at their facilities, and that's just a fact. Now, if I still have time, I want to add one more thing about contagion. I often hear, and that's the news media that has brought about all of these shootings, and that the media is overblowing the numbers. That was the first thing I heard after Sandy Hook, and I heard it a lot because I live in Washington. So you know there's nothing but news there, whether we like it or not. I started my career in the news world as a journalist, both in Chicago and in Michigan. And I watch and I read a lot of media coverage, and I worked at the FBI's Washington field office, handling their press matters for a while. During the Holocaust shooting, I was there, the Pentagon shooting, and others. So I love the media, but I'm going to tell you, the advent of the 24-hour news media cycle has been a struggle. In the 80s and the 90s, that has resulted in a plethora of inaccurate or maybe better guesswork done by media sources. So many media sources and cable news that didn't exist back then, and they are trying to fill airtime, and I respect and understand that, which is why I do media interviews, because I'd rather be on air with accurate information than let some idiot talk on air to fill airspace. So research into the media's role actually began after the 2012 killing up in Connecticut of 20 children at the Sandy Hook Elementary School. That initiated a plenitude of print and digital coverage. It was 24-hour wall-to-wall coverage. Anybody who lived through 9/11 knows what that's like. And then after Sandy Hook, the media, particularly USA Today and Mother Jones, some of you guys have done research would know this. Two respected names in the media began tallying incidents and reporting the rates of frequency. The Washington Post did that too. News began reporting these incidents, though, in an aggregate form, discussing how many people had been killed or wounded, and it prompted the creation of colorful charts behind the talking heads, and coverage began referring to shootings as the worst, or the highest, or the most damaging, and it became a quantifying game. So their intention was to bring you stories of victims and survivors and first responders who selflessly took their own life into their own hands. But now we have research on the media. And we have some research on media coverage specifically during active shooter incidents. And I would say it doesn't look that good in academics. The question is there a contagion or copycat effect, and how much research can you do? Because we know this about the research so far. Researchers at Old Dominion and University of Western Australia wanted to answer the question about contagion. So they looked at 3 years of active shooter incident coverage, specifically on ABC, World News Tonight, again, a very respected news organization, David Muir's show, beginning after the Sandy Hook shooting. They looked at 3 years of coverage, and they concluded that in the 4 to 10 days after a shooting, 3 similar shootings occurred. In the 4 to 10 days after the shooting, 3 similar shootings occurred. So they said, our findings consistently suggest that media coverage systematically causes future incidents of mass shootings. Using our benchmark estimation, a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation suggests that 57% of all mass shootings are explainable by news coverage. So Northeastern University, Illinois, and Arizona State University researchers found similar results of this type of contagion, saying that approximately 13 days after an incident, there's a higher factor for a contagion. So the media does have a conscience, despite what most of you might think. In the past few years, they've really started to self-police in terms of these volume concepts. They don't use you'll notice next time you watch a shooting, they're not talking about the worst and the deadliest and the most and the highest all the time. They're not using the names of the shooters. They're not, their goal is not to make more news. Their goal is to cover the news. So they're spending more time with survivors and victims because they recognize that they've played a part in it. And they don't like that. So here's something that is fascinating but kind of a little known fact underway. Columbia Journalism Review, anybody who's a journalist would know this. CJR is like the premier journalism, it's like the Harvard Review, right? Columbia Journalism Review is the journalism review document out of Columbia University, or in Missouri. The heart and home of journalistic contemplation, right? They've initiated, I had to say it. They initiated their own effort to manage news coverage, and CJR, which has always been at the leader, is setting up a team this year of journalists and others to evaluate best practices and establish for the media best practices to develop objective news reporting standards for active shooter incidents. And you might say, whatever. But this is the whatever. Before news media took it upon themselves to say, we're not going to do this or we're not going to do that. When they didn't have these standards, they would routinely, for instance, re-victimize the name of a rape victim by just running the name, right? Because that woman, maybe there was a trial, and so they would run the name of the victim in the trial over. It's Bill Jones is accused of raping Sally Smith, and they would run Sally Smith's name over and over again, re-victimizing her. Even on assaults and other things. The same thing with minors. The media developed a policy, we're not going to run the name of domestic violence victims. The media developed a policy, and we're not going to run the names of minors, except for in cases where they're charged 16 and over, blah, 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 something like that, right? So here's what their goal is, right? So researchers increasingly are telling us that our coverage of mass shootings has implications for public health. The shooters crave attention and infamy, and coverage that puts killers in the spotlight makes an explicit promise to those on the edge of committing mass violence. So CJR's efforts over the next year or two is going to provide guidelines for all the media coverage that's going to be a welcome addition, I think, to one piece of the puzzle, which is stopping creating a system where I want somebody to be like me. I want to be like that guy who gained infamy, like those 2 shooters at Columbine who gained infamy, and then they wrote mini-series after mini-series on them, and movie after movie, and article and article and article. And you'll notice they don't do that anymore. And I can tell you the only reason I know the name of the Virginia Tech shooter is because he lived near me. And he went to the same school my kids went to school. And two of the kids who were killed went to my kids' school. So I don't memorize the names of the shooters. I don't need to. I memorize the names of the victims and the survivors. So that's really all I came in with today, because I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions about active shooters, if there are any questions. If not, I'll make it up. No? Good. Yes?
So you mentioned that you can't just look for some random kids like video games in the in the media about like the linkage between. Is there any statistics proving that?
Yeah, actually there's statistics proving exactly the opposite. I was just some statistics on the plane when I was flying down here yesterday that said that the average amount of money spent per person in the United States is $110 per person on video games. And in China, it's 130, and in South Korea, it's 150 per person. And but the difference between per person in terms of per gun in a violent gun act, it's like in China and South Korea, it's 1. In the United States, it's 45. So absolutely not. There's no correlation at all. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that video games and violent video games have no correlation. No, whatever the right word is for you statisticians, whatever the word is, there's connection. There was another question over there somewhere. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a solution to this problem?
Yeah, I think the solution falls in two pieces, two big buckets. One is a recognition that it's not a single solution. I do get asked that a lot, like, what's the answer? And I think the first part of it is there's not a single answer. These types of incidents are all prevention, response, and recovery. When we look at it, whether you're law enforcement or not, there's all these prevention methods. There's all the ways that law enforcement and civilians can respond better, first responders can respond better, and then recover better and faster and bring the community normal or the business back to normal. This shuts businesses down. The Navy Yard building was shut down for more than a year and when the shooting occurred there. So that was a building that had 600,000 square feet. And it was shut down for more than a year. So prevention, response, and recovery. The biggest thing is we need to spend more time, money, and effort on prevention, and the people who can most help us in prevention are this audience in front of us. 5 million people how many people in the United States? Like 7 bazillion, right? 300 and some million? One of those numbers. It's a huge number, like 300 million plus in the United States, 800 law enforcement officers, 15,000 FBI agents. Like, who's going to find these people? It's not going to be us. It's not going to be law enforcement. It's going to be the next door neighbors. And statistically, we know if the kid is under 18, it's peers and teachers. And if the kid is over 18, it's family and coworkers. So you have to moxie up and be comfortable to report and be confident that there is a strong threat assessment system in place where you are from. So the second part I would add is that there's a current proposal in the House right now called the TAPS Act, T-A-P-S, and it's a threat assessment. And the TAPS Act, which they'd like to get passed, is an act that simply would help to set up a framework for threat assessment teams across the United States, so that everybody would have, hey, here's how to set up a threat assessment team in your community. Because it's really the threat assessment teams that we need for these types of incidents, these types of violent acts, are the same kind of threat assessment that we need to do for a suicide hotline. And we've figured that out for bullying. We've kind of figured that system out. We just need to tie this threat in with it, if that makes sense. Yes, ma'am.
I have a 5-year-old sister to start in kindergarten. Like, what age is appropriate to start talking?
It's a great question. Yeah, how do you train for it?
Backpacks and stuff actually help.
Yeah, should you waste your time on a really heavy backpack that has a bulletproof backpack in it? Yeah, my answer to that would be no, but that's my answer. I can tell you a 5-year-old can hardly pick up a backpack that's got a bulletproof plate in it. But there are, surprisingly, I would tell you this, there are 2 huge programs that are very effective for even preschoolers that are functioning in the United States right now. One of them is Sesame Street. Sesame Street has a whole online, you know, think stranger danger, beware, and all of that. And then the Colorado school system, which of course has suffered so many, has a massive program to train their children all the way down to a young age. There are books out written specifically for kids that are on threats. So my answer to that would be, get my card or give her your number, and I'll actually give you the information to get the books for that 5-year-old. Because the thing about training a kid is, you, particularly for teachers and instructors, you know, you're taught to train to the level of, you know, who you're talking to. Just like if you're a parent, you know, you're talking to your 6-year-old, you're not explaining to your 6-year-old why the car has no gas, explaining a combustion engine, right? You're explaining it at the level the kid can understand it. And so really that's all the danger is. There, like for instance, there's a great for little kids that where they teach little kids, they read it to them, like preschool kids, they talk about what's that little, I'm blanking out here, what's that little animal that curls up in a ball when it's afraid?
Armadillo?
Is that it? Armadillo? Possibly? Oh, armadillo? Hedgehog? I don't know. Well, maybe all of them. You know, right. I mean, maybe so. I don't know. I guess I don't have one at home. But you know what? You know, like the concept is that it kind of rolls up into its own shell, right? And it's just quiet. And that, and the book is about a little, like a little kind of baby animal like that that's taught that by its mom. Then it gets lost out in the woods, and it's afraid, and then it remembers, Mom said, if you're afraid, just curl up and be quiet. And so that's how they teach the kids. You know what? Our job right now is to just be quiet. Let's just be quiet like that little, whatever, armadillo or hedgehog or something. Hedgehogs are kind of cute, so let's go with hedgehog. But right, but that's, so that it's, you teach at their level. Because what do you want to get out of it? These occur very quickly and then they're over with. What we want to get out of it is a brief moment when everybody's quiet or when everybody takes off, right? Does that help? I think you can train kids all the way down to the young age, but you train them just like you train them to be afraid of fire, not too afraid. Train them to be afraid of a tornado or a hurricane, not too afraid. You know, there's a book out called The Gift of Fear. It's good to be afraid. It's good to know how to be afraid. That's important because then you can deal with it. Because everybody does, when we push for run, hide, fight, everybody gets run, hide, fight in concept, but they think, oh, I won't do that, or you know, I'm going to freeze. You don't. Your natural instinct is what? Fight or flight. That's your natural instinct. Your body wants to go or attack. That's what your natural instinct is. So when you have a plan, if you think about it personally and you think, boy, if this happens, I'm gone. And when I was really heartened to hear these kids being interviewed at the LA school last week or the week before, they were interviewing these kids saying, I heard it going and I just started running. They weren't thinking about it. They were just like, I go. And I think that's the same thing with kids. It's like you just, you know, maybe you don't want to send 5-year-olds out the door, right? And they're in the kindergarten room that's in the back of the building and it doesn't matter anyway. We just want them to be quiet for a few minutes. No screaming. Yes, ma'am?
As a civilian, how would we intervene in that situation and run away? Like, because you said that civilians sound like a lot of them.
Well, I'm standing here as a civilian right now because I don't have a weapon on me, right? And intervention is a tactical move, right? But bullets are coming towards you. So if you're lateral, nothing's coming towards you. There's a great on the campus in California where there was I think it was a building monitor. I don't know if he was an RA, but it was in a building where there's study halls in the front room and stuff. He's no shoes on. It's and this guy comes in with a shotgun, and he is at the little glass door right next to it. What I love is that I think he's like taking a drink of Coke or something, and he sets it down. You know, where he takes another drink and then sets it down. And he sees this guy come in past his little glass window, and the guy's looking for somebody to shoot, but the person sitting at the table doesn't look up, so he's not enticed to shoot that person. But then somebody comes walking down the stairs, so he turns with his back to the kid who has, my favorite part, no shoes on, comes out of this little alcove where the glass door is, and he walks up next to him, and he grabs the shotgun. And he just grabs it, and he just starts shaking it, and shaking it, and shaking it, and shaking it. And eventually, they both go down, and somebody else jumps on top of them. And I think part of it is lateral. Part of it is lateral. I mean, some people fight with their words. We've had teachers say, talk people out of it. But that's a big risk. There's just as many teachers. The number of in schools have been administrators.
I currently intern at the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy.
Cool.
And I noticed that a lot of SROs are having issues communicating with principals who just, they don't want to prepare for an active shooter situation. What could I help break down that barrier to prepare for the unfortunate circumstance?
Well, first read Ashley's 2-part series. And then I think that is a huge issue, the idea of schools first not wanting to do the training or thinking that their law enforcement officers are the policemen in the building for every disciplinary matter. The answer to that is they're not, right? Because they don't have the authority to act in the same way. But I think that it is a question of subtlety. The law enforcement, if SROs and the faculty or the administration doesn't want to hold training, I think one of the things that they can consider doing is bring, paper training materials, like a sheet of paper that has instructions, having them available so that other faculty members pick them up, or that they could be ask if they can be posted in the faculty lounge, for instance. So I think there's a kind of a Department of Education, and I have always had a special relationship because there's a lot of denial that goes on, particularly for the younger kids. They don't want to train young kids. I don't want to be responsible for it. I don't want to scare the kids. But the faculty, the teachers know what's going on. The teachers want the training. I just got an email from my 25-year-old who said, I can't believe they haven't had this training yet. But the training itself isn't the whole package. The teachers at Sandy Hook had trained a month earlier, 2 months earlier, in their active shooter drill, and they had trained before that. They were prepared for active shooter, and they did just what they were trained to do, and they still lost all those kids. So it's not just the training. I think it's the behavioral things. If they provide information on behavioral cues to look for, that doesn't have to be in a classroom environment. I think that there's a lot of issues about running into a building and training with law enforcement. I will tell you, I'm a strong advocate for there never should be unnoticed training. I know that people say you should, some law enforcement, and I mean a very handful because law enforcement itself doesn't support this. No law enforcement organization supports unnoticed training. You can cause heart attacks have been caused, and trauma, re-victimized people. You don't know who's out there and what they've dealt with before. So you shouldn't ever train. Law enforcement should never train in a tactical thing without notice to everybody and ability for people to opt out. That's the best practices in law enforcement, ICP and International Association of Chiefs of Police and all organizations. But even if they don't run through a drill, it doesn't mean that they can't have some advice that's provided to them, even in an email or on paper, that says, where would you go? How, how could you secret your children in the classroom? They all know it. They're all training in lockdown. They're just not training in the run and the fight part. So almost all schools are training in lockdown. And I'll tell you, it's been since the 1950s since we had a child killed in a fire in a school in the United States. Since the 1950s. And we still train fire drills 2-3 times every year, right? So there goes that excuse that it's never going to happen here. There's nothing wrong with being prepared. Yes, sir?
How would you counter
Can I tell you more about the baseline data, and then what was the other? No, there was a second question. What was your?
How would you counter an active student school shooter when they're essentially being taught the plan to go against them as a student?
I think that human nature takes over, right? There are plenty of schools that say we're not going to teach our 18-year-old that, and then you go talk to the 18-year-olds and see what they say they're going to do. Human nature is going to take over. Survival is one of the most strongest things that we have, and so it's a fast moving and over before people even really recognize it's happened, and it's instinctual. You're going to react the way you react, and part of that is going to be how you think about it ahead of time. And to answer your question, the FBI research that was initially done released in 2013, 14 I guess, July of 14, September of 14. It was, you can find everything that the FBI's done, all the studies they've done and a lot of other people have done. On your search engine, just search FBI active shooter resources. When I was up there, we set one place for every single piece of data. So that's where you can find the research, actual study, and the subsequent studies, just so you know. But is there a particular thing you'd like to know?
No, I was just interested in, I guess, when it comes to figuring out how many of these shootings actually count as active shooters.
Methodology, sure.
The measure.
Right. Yeah, what kind of methodology did we establish? So there's a lot of research out there about killings or mass shootings, and everybody kind of uses a different methodology, right? So in the FBI, one of the concerns that we had is that the research that had been done, some people were researching it saying only if 4 or more people were killed did we count it as a mass killing, or we counted it as a mass shooting. And that's not an active shooter. I mean, for law enforcement, the difference between 4 or more killed and 2 or more killed is a guy who sucks when he shoots. I mean, that's the only difference, right? It's the same action. It's the same action. So we don't care, even no one was killed. If 10 people are wounded, or he shoots a lot and he hits nobody and he commits suicide, it potentially could be an active shooter. He's trying really hard and people get away. So our methodology was, we know what causes gang warfare, drug warfare, we know domestics. We discounted, and the study research methodology says this, and most research on these areas do discount. Secret Service just released information and they did the same thing. They don't include gangs, drugs, domestics. They don't murder-suicides that are familial. We don't include a murder-suicide or a suicidal action, murder action in a home, a domestic situation, because it's not a threat to the public, right? It's not a threat that's out in the public where law enforcement gets a call and the public can do something to get away. So we discounted all of those kind of cases so we could narrow it down to this field of cases that we seem to know nothing about. And that's what we looked for, was any incident that where an active shooter, a person was actively engaged in shooting in a public arena, trying to killing or trying to kill people, whether they were on a military base or in a mall, in a dentist's office, in a school, in a parking lot. So that's the methodology that we use. But the methodology is in the research if you want to find it too. Okay? Anything else? What else can I do? Did I answer your question? I can't remember. Sorry. Thank you so much. I don't know what the time is, but I think I'm way over.
You are 1 minute over, so you're doing great.
Hey, thank you so much for letting me come today.